Hi, everybody. I'm here in my private chapel. If you've been watching Mass and all that stuff, you're somewhat familiar with the chapel. One of the things I want to do today is some of you have sent in questions, so I'm going to answer as many of those as I can get done. But also, what I wanted to do is start off by talking about my private chapel because I'm sure many people have noticed it's different than obviously the church, and even the way it's set up and how I say part of the Mass facing the tabernacle and all that stuff. So I'll explain that in a minute. The way the chapel is set up is in the Byzantine style. So in the Catholic Church, there are what we call many rites in the Catholic Church. So we as Roman Catholics, or sometimes we're referred to as Latin Catholics, from the Latin world, and because of the Latin language and all that, the origins and the history of our Western Church, another reference sometimes that is made to the Roman Catholic Church, we do things in the Western or Latin Rite, okay? And what that means is that over the centuries, the 2,000 years of Christianity from the early apostolic times, when the apostles Peter and Paul were in Rome, for example, and the early Christians that gathered in prayer with them and, after them, there are traditions that grew up from those very earliest times. And but that just didn't happen in Rome. That happened in other places in the world. So you read that in the scriptures. Peter went to Antioch, for example, Jerusalem, and so on and so on. There are certain rites or traditions that developed depending on the regions where the gospel was first proclaimed. So to be a true rite in the church, you have to be a church, so to speak, a city or a church that was founded by one of the apostles. So Peter and Paul were in Rome. Peter was in Antioch. St. James was the first bishop of Jerusalem, and so on and so on. There were many apostles who went out. St. Thomas the Apostle went all the way to India. And if you go to India on the western coast of India, there are people there called St. Thomas Rite Christians. Or there are other terms that are used as Malankese and Malankarite Christians. And these people can trace their traditions and the way they celebrate Mass and everything to the Apostle Thomas, for example, and so on and so on. And so what happened is these rites, these liturgical traditions, developed in these apostolic founded cities. And so they have special privileges in the church, and they have been preserved to this day, as of course our traditions in the Western or Latin Church or Roman Catholic Church have been preserved with us. So many of the things that we do at Mass and many of our traditions and our theology can be traced back. The essentials, all of them can be traced back to the Apostolic Church. So my chapel here is based on what we call the Byzantine or the Eastern Rite. So there are many ethnic churches that belong to this. Just like in the Western Church, we have Spanish people and Irish and Americans and Germans and all that. In the Eastern Rite, it's the same thing. We have Russians and Ukrainians and Serbians and Greeks and all kinds of ethnic groups that belong to the Byzantine Church. And why is that? Because when they went out with the gospel and proclaimed and established churches, those very areas or regions receive those traditions, and that's why they celebrate their liturgies in a little bit different way in some respects. Now, when you look at the Mass, no matter what rite it is, essentially we're all celebrating the same thing. But again, the music, the traditions, the vestments, all those things kind of differ. Even sort of the style of the church. If you go into a Byzantine or an Eastern Rite church, you'll see something very distinct than typically what you see in a Western or a Latin or Roman Catholic church. So that's what the chapel here is based upon, because I grew up in Canada going to the Byzantine church as well as the Roman Catholic church. So I am by ritual. It means I can celebrate Mass in different rites, and the Eastern Rite as well as in the Latin Rite. So, and I do that every once in a while. With that in mind, I'll tell you a few things about the chapel in general. I won't go through everything. We'll have another time where we can do question and answers as well. and I'll talk more about the chapel then. But what I want to basically say, talk about today is a few things in general. So behind me, you can see the altar, which is quite a bit smaller. Now, it's not always this small in every Eastern church. This is because it's a private chapel. It's my chapel, where I say my private masses. Up into the pandemic, I would celebrate Mass here. And I would celebrate sometimes in the Eastern Rite. So again, the vestments and some of the traditions are different. So on the altar here, you can see a number of things. Well, you can see the chalice, you can see the tabernacle. That's one thing that's unique about the Eastern Rite churches. Now, this used to be the case with us as well until the Second Vatican Council. But the tabernacle actually sits on the altar where they celebrate Mass. And then, of course, the candles around it, the chalice veil, all these things. And then this cloth, there's two of them. They're both called antimensions. These are what the Mass is celebrated on. On this one, which was given to me when I was ordained by my Eastern Rite bishop, Bishop Brecki, he signed it. It's called an antimension. And it's sort of like a corporal, the thing that we unfold when we say Mass at the altar, but it's more than that. It's also got a relic sewn in it. And so it's kind of like a mini altar, the best way to describe it. So this larger one is an antimension, but it doesn't have the relic in it, but it's large. I like it, and it was a gift from someone. This right here is a gift from, as I say, my bishop when I was ordained. On the altar as well is the blessing cross. This is used in the Byzantine liturgy at the end of the Mass. So when in the Western Church, Father blesses the congregation. In the Eastern Church, you bless with the cross, and then the faithful come up at the end of Mass, and they will come and kiss the cross at the end of Mass. So I use that when I do my Byzantine celebrations, and so on and so on. And the other thing that you'll see around my chapel is there are icons. So these are holy pictures, kind of like we have statues in the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, they have icons. Icons are holy images that are painted in a very stylized way, a certain way. They all have a similarity. We'll talk about that another time. But the icons are kind of like in the Eastern Church, the Virgin of our Western statues and things like that. So in an Eastern Church, the whole church is painted with icons, and it's all symbolic. Well, again, we'll talk about that another time. But then you also find in people's homes and chapels and things like that, pictures, kind of icons in a kind of a form of like this. And these two guys here, these are a couple of my favorite saints. Now they're in the Russian Orthodox tradition. They're not in our calendar, but they are saints, and they're real bona fide saints even for us. So you'll see these two guys. This is St. Innocent, and this is St. Herman. St. Herman was a monk. St. Innocent was a bishop. You can see he has a crown on. In the Eastern Rite, the bishops wear a form of a crown, not a mitre like our bishops wear in the West. And you see the halos around them. And these guys are very interesting. And one of the reasons I like them, they are called the Apostles to Alaska. It's really cool. Because a lot of people don't know, sadly enough, their history here in America, in the United States. But Alaska once belonged to Russia. It was purchased by the Americans not all that long ago from the Russian government, and became part of the United States. Before that, if you go up the coast of Alaska and stop in certain communities along the way, you will find Orthodox churches. And the natives, the Eskimos or Inuit, are Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. So you can see behind Innocent and Herman, there are these churches. And those are some of the churches, symbolic of the churches and the actual churches they established in Alaska. And there's one down here as well too. And that's a monastic church, and that's because of St. Herman. So these two guys, you can see Innocent is holding the gospel book. He's in the vestment of a bishop, the Eastern Church, and Herman is in the vestment of a monk, an ascetic, we call it in the East. And so both these men were sent by the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, to Alaska to evangelize and establish the Orthodox Church there, and they were very successful, and they were very holy men. So we talk about their lives a little bit more in detail another time, but that's one of the icons I have in here because, again, part of a chapel in the Eastern tradition is you have certain standard icons, like, for example, the one over the tabernacle. In every Eastern church, you will find over the tabernacle in the sanctuary, what we call the sanctuary, they call the Holy of Holies, is an icon of the Last Supper. You always find that. So that's what I have. And then on the right, facing out would be the right, is an icon of Mary, and on the left side, but your right, is Christ. And that's all, you'll always find that in an Eastern church. The image of Christ, an icon of Christ, and an icon of the Virgin Mary. The one of the Virgin Mary was given to me by friends of mine as a gift. And the one on the right actually was given to me by friends from Greece. And so both of those are kind of special to me. And so again, you'll see certain standard icons in an Eastern church. And then again, depending if it's a chapel or a monastery or whatever the patron saint of that church is, or whatever, you'll also find their icons at certain points in the church. And I like Herman and Innocent, Saints Herman and Innocent, so I have them in my chapel, you know, and other icons. And again, we'll talk about some of them. The reason I have some of these icons, that again I'll explain more another day, is because to me they represent the Church universal. They are some of the saints that are depicted on the walls are saints from the Middle East or other parts of the world or whatever, and it kind of always reminds me of the fact that the church is universal. Okay, so that's a little bit about the chapel here today, and as I said, another time we'll talk more about that. So I have some of these questions that you passed on to Ms. Campbell, and I'm going to just kind of go through as many as possible. I might divide it up into 2 sessions. We'll see what time I have. You know, I've got some appointments coming up. So, but let's start off. I kind of divided the questions up into different sections. So the first section is kind of like what I call personal questions that you wanted to find out about me. So, for one of the questions that somebody asked is, what did you want to be when you were a kid? Well, there were a number of things that I thought about when I was young. I thought for a long time actually of going into astronomy. I love astronomy. I love studying about, I read all the time. I still watch programs and connect to NASA and all this stuff. I really find all of that very fascinating. And I actually seriously gave thought to going into astronomy and stuff like that. In the end, obviously I didn't, but that was one of the things, even when I was young. I remember at night, in the summer times, my brothers and I would climb on the roof of our garage and watch the stars at night and watch the meteorites and all that kind of stuff and the satellites and try to figure out the constellations. And we had a telescope and binoculars and all that stuff. So I was always fascinated by that kind of thing. And what's interesting too is, I didn't know this when I was a kid, but the Vatican has an observatory, and there is an official astronomer, and he's a priest, Father Spitzer. He's brilliant. He's got several degrees from different universities, but he's a brilliant scientist, and but also a theologian, and he gives a lot of talks and things like that. And he's had a chance once to meet him, and really, really super nice guy, but brilliant, just a brilliant scientist. So, and that's one of the things that he does, is he researches physics and astronomy and all these kind of things. So the church has always been open to that. There have been a few bumps along the way, it's too difficult and too complicated to get into, but or at this point, but the church has always been open to knowledge. Yeah, even John Paul II wrote an encyclical, Faith and Reason. And basically the encyclical said faith and reason go hand in hand. They're not contrary to one another. They're not enemies. So we don't see science as an enemy to the faith. Okay? It's another, science is another area of seeking knowledge and truth. And it can inform us just as theology does, And the other thing I thought about when I was younger, and for quite a while, actually into my adult years, was teaching. I was thinking about becoming a teacher, but again, obviously I didn't go that route, but I do a lot of teaching anyways. So, but those are the 2 things, when I was a kid, I thought about. My mother was a teacher, my aunts and uncles, a lot of them were teachers. So I really thought that was cool. But those are the 2 things that I thought about when I was young. The next question is kind of jumping ahead to when I was a priest, I assume. It says, where were you before you moved to Fowler? Okay. Seems like I've been here forever, right? So I've been here going on 14 years now. Actually, May 8th, I think it is the day I arrived in Fowler. I think it's the 8th or the 9th, something like that. I think it's the 8th. And that was 13 years ago, and now going on 14. So before that, I was in the Flint area. I was there for about 12, 13 years as well. And I'll go right back to my first parish and then kind of bring it up to speed. So, very first parish I was assigned to was it was a temporary assignment. When we were ordained priests, we were given a temporary assignment, and the temporary assignment I was given to was a little town called Tilbury, Ontario, which is a hop, skip, and a jump away from my hometown, which was cool because I could just zip home in 15, 20 minutes and see my dad and all that stuff when I was there. I was only there for a couple months. And that was before our permanent assignments took place. And my first permanent assignment was a parish called St. Vincent de Paul in Windsor, Ontario. It was a great parish. I loved it there. And I did all kinds of stuff, youth ministry, and obviously all the regular things that priests do. We had 4 schools. I helped out at a couple of high schools, Catholic high schools as well. I just had a great time there, and I met a lot of wonderful people, and some of them I still keep in touch with to this day. So that was my first parish, and I spent about 2.5 years there. And then I was moved very, very quickly, very dramatically, for a number of reasons. By the request of the bishop, I was sent to a parish called in Tecumseh, Ontario, was St. Anne's Parish. And that was a bilingual parish. That's where we had Mass in English and in French every Sunday. So I preached, said Mass. We had a French high school, an English high school, 2 French schools, 2 English elementary schools. It was a very busy parish, big parish at the time. I don't know how many people go there anymore, but it was a big parish. And but I had a great time there. I met a lot of, again, wonderful people. And it was, again, a very, sort of different dynamic because of the bilingual nature. It was a little bit more out in the country, although not really. I mean, it had been sort of surrounded by urban development, but it still had that small town feel to it, which was great. I love that. And so I spent about, again, 3 years there. I had a great time, worked with and met a lot of wonderful parishioners and a lot of staff people there too. And then I was asked to come to the States. And that was, I think, in 1996. And I went for a year. I came across at the request of a group in the Flint area for a year to be their chaplain and did a lot of work in evangelization and then all the other stuff that priests always do. And then I went back to the States briefly, or back to Canada, briefly, and I went to a parish called St. Paul's in LaSalle. And again, I had a great time there. I was only there for a few months, but I loved it there too, and there were great people, and it was a lot of fun. And unfortunately, again, I had to leave only after a few months being there, but that was part of the assignment. And then I ended up coming back to the States, and I've been here ever since. So it was very interesting. And as I said, I was in Flint for about 12, 13 years in that area, and then I came here about 14 years ago. So that's kind of the whole lineup of parishes I've been to and things, a little bit of what I've done. Somebody asked a question about my early life as a priest, what I did when I was first ordained. So I kind of explained that with some of the parishes that I just mentioned. I would say one of the things that characterized the first few years is busy. And I like to be busy. And so the first couple parishes in particular, St. Vincent de Paul, St. Anne's, were big, busy parishes. And I thought it was a lot of fun. And I got my hands in all kinds of stuff, whether it was sometimes like at St. Vincent or St. Anne's, singing with the choir when I wasn't saying Mass, because at both parishes there was another priest with me, a pastor, and I was the associate pastor. So I had a little bit more freedom. So a lot of times at the Masses that I wasn't preaching at or saying, I would sneak up to the choir and sing along with them, all that kind of stuff, and then hang out at the end of Mass and say goodbye to people, all that kind of thing. And I loved all that stuff, having that kind of freedom and then doing some of those fun little things that I can't do now because I'm by myself, and I'm the pastor. So, there were a lot of those things, again, in the first parish I was at, and all the parishes I've had, I've always been involved in youth ministry. Still, for example, in the very first parish I was at in St. Vincent de Paul, we started a custom of going out on Canadian Thanksgiving on the Monday after and spend the day together with some of the young people from youth group. And we'd bring our leftovers from Thanksgiving dinner and we go pick apples, and then we go out to a big park out in Lake Erie, and we'd play football and have a barbecue and eat, and just hang out and be with one another. And to this very day, I still do that. In October, when it's Canadian Thanksgiving, it's been a few years I haven't been able to go, but in the last few, I've made it, again, a priority to go back and hang out. And now these young people that were in my youth group are now our parents themselves and have their kids, and they bring them along. So it's kind of neat. So, those kind of things were great when I had that kind of freedom, and did a lot of work, as I say, in youth ministry and youth groups, going to Steubenville with young people, all that kind of stuff. And of course, all the parish work. And one of the things that at St. Anne's, the second parish I was at, one of the reasons I was asked to go there by the bishop is they were renovating the church, just like here at Most Holy Trinity a number of years ago. They restored the church. Well, we did that in St. Anne's. St. Anne's is even bigger than our church. It's huge, and it's in the same similar style as this church, but even more ornate. We hired a company, and they restored all the paintings and the ceilings and the walls and the high altar and everything. It really turned out beautiful, and all that stuff. And that's the reason I was asked by the bishop to go there, because I have some of that background in art and design and liturgy and all that. So the pastor really wanted me, and so the bishop asked me if I'd go, and I said, well, of course I'd go. And so anyways, that was a very exciting, in a way, seeing this very old parish, just probably older than here, because that parish was established by the French going all the way back into the 1700s. Now the present church is old, but not quite that old. But there's, again, it's a really old French-Canadian settlement, and there's all that tradition, and they had a lot of fun things. Like in the summer, they had a big corn festival. One of the things, that it was a rural community like here in Fowler, and one of the things they did is they grew a lot of sweet corn in the area, and so they'd have the village in Tecumseh would put on this great big festival, sweet corn festival. It was a lot of fun. So there were a lot of things like that. That was great. Again, great to know the people, and getting to know the village, and hanging out with folks and all that kind of stuff. So, all right. So that's a little bit about my early days. That seems like a long time ago. So I just celebrated my 30th anniversary of ordination just a little while ago. So it seems like a long time ago. But, in other ways, it seems just like yesterday. I'll answer a few more questions here, and I think then we'll call it quits, and then we'll go on another day and answer the rest of the questions. So these are kind of categorized all about, again, the priesthood. So one person asked, did you want to be a priest when you were little? Actually, my desire to look into the priesthood didn't happen until I was in high school. I had a great respect for the priesthood, and I was always, kind of close to our parish priests and things like that, but I didn't show interest until I was in high school. I never played Mass at home. Everybody talks about that now, like, oh, we play Mass at home. Never did that. And actually, believe it or not, I was never an altar server, not until high school. I used to help Father in our daily Mass at high school. It wasn't anything fancy. It was in one of the old classrooms and all that kind of thing, but I used to serve for him. But I will tell you this, I knew every word the priest said, and I knew every move and everything that went on at Mass. So I wasn't an altar server. My youngest brother was, my brother Jeffrey. A couple of funny stories from that time. I'll tell you another time, but I knew every word, everything that went on in the Mass. I paid attention. And I will tell you this, I'll kind of end with this. I'll tell you this one story from high school. So our high school was a convent high school. It was the Ursuline sisters that taught us, and it was connected to their mother house, which meant their headquarters, their international headquarters. So this group of Ursuline sisters, that was their home base, and that convent had been there since the 1800s, a long time ago, and they had built onto it, and it was a big place. And they built a high school, because that was the sisters' charism. They were teachers, the Ursulines, at least this branch of Ursulines were. And so they were great teachers. I have many fond memories of the sisters. And some of them actually had taught with my mother and knew my parents and all this stuff. And yeah, and as I say, in high school, I would serve mass, and sometimes like the daily mass and in the high school, that the students were welcome to come, and then sometimes at the big chapel in the convent where the sisters' chapel was, and where we would gather, the whole school would gather for mass. So it was a great big chapel, and it was a circular chapel because it was designed like the crown of Mary, interesting enough, month of May. And it was this circular chapel with beautiful stained glass windows, and then the top of the chapel was open. There was a skylight, and on top outside was like a crown, so it was like the crown of Mary, really beautiful. And so we would celebrate mass at least once a month as a school in the sisters' chapel. Well, anyways, one day one of our teachers, Mrs. Brown, she was a single gal, and she taught athletics in our high school. She got engaged, and she asked the sisters if they could have their wedding in the sisters' chapel, in the convent chapel. And the sisters were all excited and said, sure, of course. And so they invited the whole school to their wedding. I thought that was really cool. So it wasn't just like this private thing. Everybody from school was welcome to come, which I thought was really, really neat. And so I went. It was a Saturday morning, and I went there, took my place in chapel. I wasn't asked to do anything special. I just came as a guest and sat myself down. And lo and behold, I watched the procession come in, all this stuff, and I'm looking, and there's one of the guys who's an altar server, and his name was Wayne. And I knew Wayne, and Wayne was a bit of a troublemaker. And I thought to myself right away, I thought, I didn't know that he knew how to serve mass. Well, lo and behold, he did not. And he was an athlete. He was a very good athlete. And I think that's part of why they asked him to serve at the mass. And he probably was reluctant to say no. Anyways, I'm just, paying attention to mass, following things. So anyways, the table, the credence table we call it, where all the gifts are placed, the chapel was circular, semicircular. So we were all facing around the altar. So I'm sitting right behind the credence table, the table where the gifts for mass were placed. All of a sudden, this is the funniest thing, Wayne came to the table, and I was kind of just happened to notice him, and his eyes and my eyes met. And I could tell right away he had no idea what he was doing. He was terrified. And he just stood there. And so this is what he did. This is the funny part. So he stood at the table and he started doing this with his hand, touching things. The wine, the water, the chalice. And when he got to the right thing, he was looking at me the whole time. I went, yup. Yeah, I didn't say a word. I just nodded. He picked it up, went to the altar, came back, and he did the same thing. Touch, touch, touch. And finally got to the wine. I nodded. Yep, that's it. And it took him through the whole mass that way. It was the funniest thing. He never thanked me. He never said a word to me after. I thought, oh, the little bugger. But it was the funniest thing. I'll never forget that as long as I live. But that's a funny little thing that happened. Now, this before I was a priest, but there's lots of little stories like that I can tell you, and will tell you in the next segment that we do question and answers. So hold on to your TVs or whatever you're watching on, and there'll be more stories to come. Okay, well, have a good day, everybody. Bye.